you're just meandering through.
Yeah.
And it just flows. I think that's how a lot of podcasts these days work.
Exactly.
That's sort of the form of them. So
Cool.
yeah,
All right, well, I'll kick off.
fantastic.
As you take your cup of tea sip, just want to say thanks for meeting me. This is really nice. I know it's a late afternoon, so you've probably already seen quite a few people, and I'm probably one of the last in the row, but thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
No, my pleasure.
So I was actually just saying to you before we turned the microphone on that I did a psych degree a long time ago myself. So I've always had a very keen interest in this profession. And even though I didn't end up being a psychologist, as I understand, in order to be practicing, you do have to have the postgraduate qualification and then some practice. So there's obviously quite a high standard in terms of, being a health professional of this sort. The fun thing that I think is that I don't think a day goes past where I don't somewhat lean into the things that I've either read or learned about during that time in everyday walks of life, like whether it's meeting other people, trying to understand situations, trying to understand myself, feelings, the whole entire thing. So, psychology is what makes us human. It's the science of behavior. Is that right? Is that
Look, absolutely. The idea is that there is a scientific application to trying to understand how people behave, feel, their thinking, and what tries to separate us from other therapy or counselling is that we do apply that scientific method. So
yeah, very much so.
The great importance of being able to do a double-blind test or see that what we are doing in therapy, in fact, is an improvement on no treatment at all or other methodologies. So it is really important that we are scientist practitioners, so to speak. At the same time, much of what we do still has a lot of soft skills and the like, and that's a little bit harder to understand and appreciate. And how do you go out and measure that?
Yeah.
But most certainly, that scientist practitioner model is super important.
It is. And I guess that's exactly what gives the profession so much validity, that it is based in science, but deals with something that's unpredictable, forever changing. Everybody's unique, but then again, not. The whole entire thing, it's dealing with the complexities of humans. And it's coming from a very stable base of science, but ultimately it requires a lot of information, a lot of interpreting, a lot of analysis in order to kind of understand what situations are. Before we get too deep into this, I guess what I wanted to talk to you about is two things. On the one hand, I want to talk about you, which is probably not that common in a situation such as this where we're sitting in your office. But I did want to find out, when did you get bitten by this bug and realize that this is actually something that you wanted to kind of dedicate your life to? That's one thing. But I also kind of wanted to unpack the work that you do day to day, because I think, or at least I don't know whether people would actually know the kind of work that you'd be dealing with every single day and the kind of cases you might be working with. And of course, there are different kinds of psychologies, whether it's clinical and otherwise. So we could even talk about that a little bit. But I did want to give people an insight into the profession per se.
Sure.
But first things first. And I like the fact that you did mention, obviously, the science base and the slight difference between, say, for example, counseling, difference perhaps between psychiatry as well, which is slightly different. Tell me, just from your perspective, how did your journey come about? Like, the fact that you ended up being the psychologist that you are today, when did the journey start? Do you remember when it all happened?
Look, I think I have a bit of a funny backstory, at least interesting to me.
Sure.
I, in a previous life, was in the military, trained to be a mechanic, and I attended a personal development course. And so I already had clearly some ambition as a young person, but having attended that course, I got highly ambitious and it really transformed my life. I started to take on some of these ideas. They were extreme ideas, I must say, but they were enough to propel me towards this idea, which I think happens for a lot of young people in an idealistic world, that I wanted to share the light with everybody.
Yeah.
What I learned, and it's transformed my life, and now I want others to see the light, which is such a funny story because, many of us continue to do that in life. And so after probably a good year of searching what that might look like, the idea of psychology in terms of becoming a psychologist, studying came about. And in my mind, the ambition was, if this is going to open up the avenue for me to have maximum capacity to be able to tell this story and explain to people the light, then that's what I would pursue. Thankfully, throughout the degree, many of the nonsense that I had learnt, and I call it nonsense because it just wasn't grounded in any scientific method, but it was enough to propel me to actually really do something on a whim. And so the university experience really shook that out of me. Took some period though. There was certainly a good 3-4 years that I probably held on to many of those.
Still wanting to prove that.
Well, just some of the concepts, some of the ideas, even some of the social psychology stuff that is very powerful. This particular personal development course would lean into many of these things. It's just that it would push it to the nth degree. And so by the time I got through my training, thankfully, the evidence-based.
You saw a different light.
I saw absolutely a different light, and well said in actual fact. And that I think is this big defining difference. And so that's kind of the way that I did my or found my purpose, so to speak. And the rest is history.
So it's interesting because it makes me think, what is psychology to you? And I'll just say to you what my perspective of it is. To me, psychology, of course, I'm not a psychologist. I've mentioned this is just an interest. So there's no comparison between you and I here. But I'd like to think that I use it as a tool to be able to understand other situations or other people, and many times actually myself, in order to be a better human being. And by better, I do mean a better communicator, more empathetic, in tune, more efficient communications with other people, being able to relate, all those things that kind of make social situations quite important. So to me, it's actually quite a basic and maybe it is a basic way of looking at it. And it's interesting because you talked about the light and the education and a different light. I would imagine some people would think psychology is about helping others, kind of outreaching thing. What is it to you?
Psychology to me, in its very traditional sense, is, and the way that I look at it, is a basis upon which you can understand how people behave, think, and feel. So it's a study of that. Once that study has been complete, and I say that maybe in inverted commas because it's never complete, but a reasonable baseline has been formed or a platform has been formed, it can then guide how you might use it. And I think what you've picked up on beautifully is we use this every day, all of us. You don't have to be a psychologist to be obviously using psychology. We're all using it ourselves, whether it's self-improvement, whether it's self-reflection, whether it's thinking about how other people might respond to you. Social acuity is something that, we can improve on and so on. It's just being used all the time. Obviously, in my work, it's very much used from the base of someone has some type of angst, usually, that they're dealing with, and they're looking for a way to, most of the time, a way to remove it or reduce it, which might be a little bit different to what we end up doing in therapy, because some things can't be reduced or removed, like grief, for example, or there's many things in life we've got to do. So for me, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of living. For me, there's a philosophy behind it as well. I practice a particular therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, and that kind of informs how I try and live. And so it's one angle, so to speak, or one modality in therapy that can be used, but it certainly informs how I, probably the best language to use is how I relate with the world. And that means relate with others, relate with myself, relate with the thoughts that I have, relate with my values or my ethics, the goals that I have, life that is unbelievably strange in the infinite number of scenarios it can put in front of me and will put in front of me. All the unknowns, there's an acceptance of all the unknowns, and acceptance kind of leans into how you relate with something. And as you can tell from the modality of being acceptance and commitment therapy, a large portion of that is acceptance, so accepting all the things that are in life. And then the action part or commitment part is kind of committing to your values, the things that make life rich.
Sure.
And so in life, you don't always get to choose what comes your way. So you might have to accept a lot of those things, grief, difficulties, responsibilities.
As well as the highs as well. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
the thing. It throws your own, because I guess the interesting thing is quite often, in life as human beings, we want to be able to control and direct the things that are happening to us. But the truth of the matter is, the thing that we call life, generally, all the circumstances around us, we can never be completely in control of that. We can put ourselves in particular situations, but really, I think the art is dealing with the things that are put in front of you. And what I'm hearing, especially when you said, a lot of the clients that you see are those who have something that they want to overcome. They clearly can't overcome it on their own, because then they would. And maybe it's about, how do I control this thing, even if I can't overcome it per se. So it makes a lot of sense to me the way that you're looking at that.
And so even while you're speaking, my mind is constantly
Sure.
firing. Even using the word, how do we deal with something, that implies a control. And acceptance implies more around, how do I live with that is out of my control. And so it's great when we can control something. Absolutely, I'd encourage people to do so. However, sometimes there's a cost of trying to control so many things. It comes at the cost of our values. Or we're trying to control something that is not controllable. Like my feelings, thoughts that show up that I can't actually control. And so the way that we relate with those and obviously accept can be quite liberating. But it's just interesting to notice that just having this conversation, how I can hear all those little nuances, which is really what a psychologist should be doing.
Yeah, great. Actually, just, as you said that you've done your studies quite some time ago. I mean, you look very young, so it couldn't be that long ago. But nevertheless, I wonder whether you have seen a shift in the way that psychology as a profession, for those helping individuals, has kind of come into the mainstream a little bit more. And the reason that I say that is, when I was doing psychology, was definitely seen as only needed by those people who've already got psychological problems. Waving my hands around here because that could mean different things. So in other words, you've already got some kind of issues that are above normality, and you look at normality curves and all these kind of things, and you say, if you're sitting out here, then you have these, and there's disorders and all this. So quite an extreme vision of it, almost the same way as you would think of medicine or the medical profession only treating diseases and people who are sick, as opposed to, say, for example, the wellness industry, which is more about healthy life and balance and all those kind of things. So there's been a big change in that too. Have you found that as well? Because I think I know that in America, for example, the idea of going therapy, as they call it, is quite common. In Australia, it still isn't culturally, I don't think. But most certainly, I think the stigma for seeing a psychologist or getting help with those issues is coming off. It's becoming, again, seeing psychology as a tool rather than seeing somebody for a cure to a massive problem that's taken place. Have you found that difference? And have you found that in the people that come and see you, and perhaps the perspective that you get from others who hear that you're a psychologist, and think, well, that's okay, you're dealing with normal people, again, in inverted commas?
I say this based on the practice that I work in, being private practice.
Yep.
We see a small or a select sliver of the community. So we don't see the entire range, and psychology is offered across the board, from the most severe and acute situations, which don't tend to spend much time in private world because they've got other
Yep.
factors that might need to be addressed beforehand, or that gets in the way with them being able to engage in therapy consistently. But there's certainly been a shift around that stigma space. I certainly feel where previously lots of stigma, and that psychology is really reserved for people with illness, some sort of diagnosis, something wrong with you, that type of language. And I think these days, having come from a referral avenue from GPs has shifted. So once upon a time, there was no Medicare funding or rebates or support. And from about, I'd say 17, 18 years ago, when Medicare opened up its doors, so to speak, to take on psychology as a rebatable service, the floodgates absolutely opened. And that's because, let's say, for example, here in Canberra, you might have 800 GPs. They all become advertisers for psychology because they don't necessarily want to be doing that work. They can't actually be doing that work in a probably 10-minute consult by the time they write up their notes. And so they were very, very happy to have psychologists on board and be able to, refer on. And so from that basis, psychology has absolutely exploded in Australia.
Yeah.
Absolutely exploded. And with that has come a lot of advertising that the government has done really effective campaigns, and the stigma has reduced. What that I think has meant, though, is that there's many more people accessing psychology, not just in that acute phase anymore, but rather everybody. People who are going through a challenge, which is quite rewarding work for us as well. It's rewardable work no matter what. People who are motivated, they already are fairly insightful, quite well educated, have got a reasonable understanding and handle on some of the challenges they're facing. They're just not able to get over that hurdle. And often it's about those little things like acceptance versus control, avoidance of a pain rather than making space or room for that pain and still doing what you can do. And so, yes, the stigma has shifted. More people are accessing. With that has become a much better language set as well. And I like to say that the people that I work with, I wouldn't even say treat, I'd say work with, come from that one category, that one diagnosis called the human. And so humans come in with all sorts of challenges, and we work together to try and reduce their suffering. And there's a little concept that maybe steals a little bit from the Buddhist philosophy, but there's an idea around pain being unavoidable, but suffering is something that can be, managed or can be worked on. And so if we work on that model where we're saying we're trying to reduce suffering while we accept a level of pain, because there's lots of things that will occur that we don't like.
It's interesting you're saying this. I've got a baby boy who's, 6.5 months, maybe closer to 7 now. I should say I do know. I'm close enough, but I don't know exactly.
It all becomes a blur.
Well,
Right?
no, I know he was born, but very bad at numbers that quickly. But it's interesting. The thing that you're saying seems so basic in a way, but it's actually quite hard to develop. Exactly the thing they've mentioned, understanding the difference between pain and suffering. But I could imagine if you're set on your right way early on in life with that kind of teaching and the ability to speak to perhaps your parents would be, could be your greatest psychologist, right? Or your siblings or somebody else in the family or a close friend. But if you learn that, it might be easier later in life. But many of us don't get these kind of teachings till quite a bit later and almost have to do this backwards homework to sort things out, which sometimes is probably part of the blockage, if I can call it that, in overcoming things. Would I be right, by the way, in having this kind of very basic assumption that if people are thinking, why would I need to see a psychologist? Why don't I just talk to somebody else? I think the interesting thing about us is from an objective perspective, especially if you're skilled and a professional such as yourself, you're able to understand somebody else in a slightly different light and pattern, which they themselves cannot see because it's very difficult looking at a mirror and seeing the truth. We have our own things that are getting in the way. It's a little bit like, I don't know, a surgeon trying to operate on themselves. They've got all the knowledge. It's just that there will be too much preventing you from doing that, because obviously it'd be painful and everything else. And you have to be separated from that to make rational decisions and whatever else. So would I be right in saying that the truth of the matter is that at some point within our psyche and what have you, it is actually very difficult to go quite deep into ourselves by ourselves and understand things. And we almost need a guide such as yourself in order to have a different perspective and see it almost from your perspective, or balance out something that otherwise just becomes a constant loop of rethinking. Is that a basic but correct way of thinking about it?
Yes, and if I can elaborate on
Please.
that as well. First of all, I think addressing the first point, which is I think there's great value in reaching out to friends, reaching out to family members. As a matter of fact, loneliness is such a big problem in today's society that we don't have many people we can lean on or that we feel comfortable, confident to lean on. But we do know that the more we are supported socially, the better the likelihood that our well-being is. And the analogy is very simple. If you've got a table with 3 legs, if you pull one of those legs out, it'll topple over. But if you've got 5 legs or 10 legs or 30 legs, you can rip out 3 legs. If you've got 30 legs, it makes no difference.
Sure.
You're very robust. And so that social space is really important, which means people you can trust, rely on, that you're comfortable with, that you can have on your side when things get tough. And they can share the load. Some people don't have that, or they might have that, but they're looking, they're not, I suppose, getting as far as they would like. Or sometimes they want to fast track something as well in terms of, deal with something might be a bit deeper. I think what psychology offers first and foremost is non-judgment. These walls, they are confidential walls. Nothing leaves this room. And when you're in a room where nothing will ever leave, you can be a lot more open, not only with your psychologist, but in actual fact with yourself. When you say words about yourself that you will not say to anyone else, even that act is quite powerful. That can only happen because there is confidentiality and privacy, but it also means that the psychologist creates an environment which says, I'm also not going to judge you. Now, I have the privilege of being able to do that because I'm not invested in that closeness with my clients, and hence why I can't see my siblings. I can't see parents. I can't see friends. I can't even see children of friends. This is the same reason why a surgeon cannot do their work on people that they know, because it changes your behaviour.
Includes the judgments.
Right? So we call this clinging, attaching. It changes the way we work. So an example that happens all the time when friends, family, people that I know approach me and they say, Nesh, I've got this difficulty. I want to open up to you privately. Who can I go and see? I will make an appointment with one of my clinicians, but I don't tell my clinician. I don't want them to change the way that they are helping my family, friends, whoever it might be. Exactly what they're doing is the best way that I want them to behave, which is treat everyone like family, but that just means don't let them know. And so there's something really powerful about an environment where absolute zero judgment. And that comes from a very strong understanding of psychology that some people will recognize, which is an unconditional positive regard. We hold that in the room always, and from that space, I think we can be really curious, try and understand, And it's not only understanding the solution, it's actually understanding what is it that makes it hard for someone to traverse past that solution. So many of us know what a solution looks like. We just don't know how to actually actively, consistently do it because we're contending with, for example, representations of judgment, of fear, of worry, of rejection that stop us from doing these things. So to avoid rejection, I just won't go out and talk to that person, or I won't apply for that thing, or I won't put my hand up. There's lots of things that we do to avoid, and that's another fundamental piece of psychology is that, avoidance is often at the heart of many of our problems.
So in some way, the fact that we're strangers, say, for example, I came to see you, is actually a huge advantage because that provides not only separation, but also provides me with the knowledge that I can be, well, as open as I want to be. That makes a lot of sense. And it goes back to the same point that if I'm thinking about myself, there eventually is a wall that I hit about being able to objectively have this kind of stranger relationship, so to speak.
And it happens in the therapy room. This is what's so fascinating and why I love psychology so much. The minute someone familiar comes into this room, and it can be someone that I don't know, they could be familiar on the basis of they are another psychologist.
Okay.
Then I'm already in a space that I'm uncomfortable because I start to feel like I'm being judged if they're watching my work.
Sure. And probably vice versa.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden the dynamic is a very, very complicated one. If a psychiatrist comes in, if a GP comes in. So these are all the, air quotes, important people. And we do this around just anyone, celebrities. Everyone gets a bit flustered around celebrities.
Sure.
What do you do? What happens if, the Prime Minister comes in or, we're intimidated. And so we change our practice. And that's just human nature.
Well, we start thinking about how we want to be perceived, and therefore we start acting in that way, and it changes things. Yeah,
all sorts of things. Sometimes we try and give special attention to someone, which means that you're kind of out of your groove, rather than saying, I'm going to give them the exact attention that everybody gets because that is absolutely grounded in evidence base, in building a therapeutic rapport, in not going out and getting caught up about what we call transference and counter-transference. This is all the stuff that the psychologist is dealing with in session as well. So it's quite funny when we kind of reflect and we look at it, how important those things are. And this is what psychologists do. We have supervision with each other to talk about this stuff because we're humans as well. So I'm in the room, I'm human. I've got every flaw that everyone else has as well. And maybe if we remove the word flaw, we just say I have the same nature. And so now you've got two people with a nature in a room trying to work together. But there are, barbs that we're getting caught on.
Yep. You've mentioned something before about people often knowing solutions, but finding it difficult to make them work or stick to them. There's this, joke that I remember hearing in my first ever Psychology 101 class. And it went something like this: how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is none. Does light bulb want to change itself? Now, no one laughed because I don't think you understand. I don't think it's even a joke. No one really understands what the meaning of that is to get to the end of that particular semester, and you realize that actually it's all about the person wanting to change. The power comes from within. And it reminded me when you said that thing about, we have no solutions but don't know how to get to them. Am I right that psychology is not about finding an external point of view and then providing someone with a solution and say, you go and do this? I'm sure you'd be able to give them tools and steps, but it's actually about that person finding their way out using those tools themselves. It's an act of empowerment, hence that bad joke. Is that right?
I'd describe it as a process.
Okay.
And within the process, because we're human, it's incredibly complicated. And there are people who come to work with a psychologist who are highly motivated. At the same time, they can be highly motivated towards getting a strategy, applying a strategy. And that might not actually be what the psychologist feels is appropriate for them because that might still be based on I'm trying to control. So I've got a controlling, let's say, nature, and I'm just going to go to a psychologist to get more control. And it might be our job in that instance, for example, to try and provide a opportunity for the client to see a different perspective, and that perspective could potentially be that it's great that you've got control, but some of your angst and struggle is coming from perpetually controlling, and we're starting to notice that there are things that you actually just can't. You're overwhelmed with that, and so we need to develop psychological flexibility, which means range in selecting tools. And one tool might be control, but another tool or approach might be about letting go of control, letting things be, changing our standards, changing our expectations, changing the rules that we have about ourselves or others. And that could potentially remove some of the tension that they're dealing with. Other times it might be, yeah, you're right, you could apply more control. But later on in life, I'd like you to still be able to walk away with the other piece of I suppose, that seesaw, which is psychological flexibility. And so we all have superpowers, meaning our nature. We're just trying to extend what other powers I could have available to me. So there's nothing wrong with anyone's design. It just means that the way we tend to think about things and look at things is narrow.
Yeah.
It lacks variation. And so psychologists can engage in opening up variation perspectives and looking at what is it that motivates them. Now, values is a big part of motivating someone or giving an opportunity for someone to be motivated, to be inspired by what's inside them. And so really understanding what makes me tick, what excites me, or even the opposite, what angers you, what makes you really frustrated, excuse my language, what pisses you off.
Yeah.
That's really important because behind that is a value. Because things that frustrate you have got some type of significance. They represent something. It might be unfairness or injustice or whatever it might be. You find this behind anger.
Yeah, and it's interesting that and empowerment comes from knowing what that is and why you're triggered by particular things and why you have a particular standpoint. I'll just go back to this moment because it made me think this level of objectivity that psychologists provide and how important it is. I didn't actually realize that how important that is to the whole entire process. I'm sure you're familiar with that 16 personality test that one can do online. It kind of separates people out into personalities. It's quite basic. Nevertheless, we did it as a bit of a exercise at work. In fact, I've done it many times. And I've always been surprised by the answer that comes back. But at least I know it's correct because every time I've done it, even if I try to slightly alter the way I'd like to think about myself, it still comes back with the same thing. And I like that because in a way it says, see, that thing's objective. It's not telling what you want to hear. It's what you are. And I've come to accept the fact that I'm this particular 16 personality and not another one, which now I quite like. But another thing is that we did this other test with like a work-based psychologist that came to our office, some exercises. And I realized that my colleagues thought I was exceptionally fair. That was one of my biggest attributes. I would have never picked that in a million years. I'm thinking, what do you mean? Like, I didn't go around kind of spooking fairness. And they said, no, think about it. Think about all the time you've protected division, that you've stood up for things because you actually thought they were unfair. Here I thought I was just doing that because I'm protecting my team. And, frankly, it makes me look bad. Again, I think the truth is definitely not just what we think, but what others think and the fluidity between that. And I've just realized, how powerful the fact that you're speaking about something that's important to you with someone that you don't know, that's actually the magic,
Mm.
which seems at odds in the first instance, but kind of makes perfect sense in the way you do things. Um, with you personally, and I always wonder this with psychologists who have actually got quite a few years behind them. I've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of patients, clients, I should say. How do you keep distance between that and yourself? Because you could imagine with all the conversations, some of them being tougher, some of them being lighter, some cases going for longer, whatever it may have been. Does it have an impact on you? And do you have an ability to place a cloche on your personal slash professional life in a way that it doesn't affect you negatively, as in burdens you, so to speak, other people's problems and so forth. Yeah, I wonder how you keep that separation to make sure that you're quite healthy and always objective. And again, it doesn't psychologically affect you in a negative sense.
Sure. I can only speak for myself
Cool.
rather than any of my peers. Very early on, probably the first year of practice, and I wasn't a psychologist then. I was working alongside a couple of psychologists and I was receiving supervision. And I certainly noticed myself becoming somewhat stressed with whether it was workload or trying to see as many clients as I humanly could. And that was showing up, coming back to that place of control. I wanted everyone to get better. And my version of better, my version of success, my version of, reduced suffering. And I had a great supervisor at the time that was able to gently point that out. And so you can kind of reflect on it and you're trying to improve your own practice. And I can genuinely say after that, being able to observe that in myself, I changed what it was that I was trying to do, where I was no longer invested in the outcome for my client, but rather still being available for them. And so, if they had success, although I might celebrate with them so that would hopefully reinforce and they would have the courage to repeat that, I wouldn't necessarily celebrate because I knew that was just one part of it. And next week there'll be some challenge. And so I wouldn't necessarily then go, oh, that's terrible. I still see this as being an opportunity for learning, reflection, and so on. So for me, I take very little home. I can't say nothing because I still invest in my clients and I'm human. And there's many a time where I will feel what the client is feeling. In theory, you're not supposed to sympathize too much. I think if you're human, you do. You're supposed to empathize, but you're human, so you do, and you do connect at a level. The idea is, but you need to maintain impartiality, objectivity,
Sure.
and still be able to do your job. And so for me, it's really important to provide that, and I get great pleasure from supporting my clients, irrespective of how they're going. Some have got some very difficult histories that they're contending with. Things that have been said in this room would bring most people, if not all people, to tears.
Yeah.
I've certainly, experienced, teariness and the like when you hear such pain and suffering, particularly in people's lives when they're little. That innocence being harmed and
Of course.
vulnerability and the like, and certainly having children emphasize that even more. At the same time, I have to believe in the work that we do that that doesn't necessarily have to go out and be the whole of one person. It's a part of one's experience, but it's not. You don't get damaged by that, and then that you are the scar.
Yep.
You're a human that has a scar, but you're not defined by it. There's many things in life, and as a matter of fact, a good, rich life has many, many, many scars. And I'm not suggesting that we all share the same ones or that they're the same, but sometimes we can find value or something can come from those as well. And there's great philosophical stories I could tell. I'm not sure the farmer and the horse story. I won't bore you now. It's not the right time. But do look it up. It's this
Sure.
beautiful, beautiful philosophical approach of not go or of reserving judgment.
Yep.
Rather than going out and immediately saying something is right or something is wrong. Reserving judgment because it tends to change over time.
Hmm. And I could imagine, I mean, let's be honest, there is no profession or extended contact with human beings or communities that isn't going to impact us and change us. I mean, it's normal, and that's actually what makes us interesting human beings. So it only makes sense. I did just wonder about that fine line between it being too much. So it doesn't, it essentially doesn't impact on you personally in a way that is negatively. But I do love the fact that you just said, I believe in what I do. I believe in the tools that I use. And I guess that's the answer there.
I think it has a very positive impact. On the other hand, I know that we obviously sometimes we think it might have this kind of vicarious, negative affect, but I think it has an incredibly positive effect. Or certainly for me, many a time, I would say that my chair could become your chair and your chair become mine, because what my clients are saying are often experienced by myself. I might not necessarily share that, or I might offer a small snippet of that to demonstrate that we're human, but they're not very different to me. We just have different stories.
Yeah.
To the fact that I'm currently organising for some signage to be in the waiting area, which says exactly that. Something around the perspective of due to chance and maybe some small items of fate that I could be in your chair and you could be in mine.
Sure.
Because there's truth in that. We're made of the same cloth, so to speak. That's what psychology says, that we are the same, more so than we are different. And we kind of know this because, if we were to turn off the television sound and just watch people and you take away, all these things that you and I can make judgment on, you just realise that they're all the same human beings. It doesn't matter where they are.
Yeah.
I have this little thing, and you being a new father, I love being a father. It's the best thing in the world. But there's this beautiful leveling that happens when you become a mum or dad. We all think, or at least we're pursuing as young people or young adults, a career and status and a role and a title.
Yeah.
All this interesting stuff. And then you become a parent, and then you wipe a bottom, and then you go, the Prime Minister wipes the bottom. All these people that I theoretically look up to, they all wipe bottoms. We're all exactly the same. And you just watch people pushing strollers around, looking like zombies, sleep deprived, tired. It's a beautiful leveler.
It is.
And a one that thankfully comes reasonably early in life to say, hey, wake up. And obviously your kids say, what's important, Dad? Well, at least that's the way I've reflected.
It's also a connector. I've realized that there is a whole language that parents have, usually at different stages of their children's development. And they really lean into it. Now, I've always been the outsider on that. I've never had particular interest in talking about other people's kids and stuff.
Sure.
Niceties I can, but you know what I mean? I didn't really want to know about everything about them. But now I can lean into that. And even though I'm not the first one to start talking about my baby boy and, he's done this and he's done that, because I never really enjoyed it that much because it's my kid. I just presume that no one cares. But when people do engage in that and they say, what about yours? How is he doing? And I enjoy that conversation. I can use the same language. And all of a sudden, I'm connecting on a slightly different level about these little human beings with others who I probably would have not before had a very common language. And I kind of like that. It's opened up my community in that respect.
So you've just tapped into some of the most important parts of understanding how humans are, and it's the need to belong. But by becoming a dad, you immediately are welcomed into this group. We can stand around and go, "Oh, you're a dad. I'm a dad. I I get you.
I get you.
Man.
What, you've been wiping bottoms.
And this is exactly what my military life did. We used to call it us and versus the civvies being civilians.
Yeah.
We knew what it meant to go through our training. We do this. There's that tribal mentality that we all kind of find our group, but it doesn't matter where the belonging comes, where there's a parent or being part of the tech world or sport. But a sense of belonging is unbelievably important in terms of security and feeling at ease, reducing anxiety, meaning, purpose. And so, it's at the heart. It's another one of those real solid legs that we want to have under table supporting it.
All I'm thinking of now is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm thinking, so what is it? Is it shelter? And then it kind of blows up and very quickly gets into, well, essentially you need to be connected and social. And look, it makes so much sense. In fact, I had two last questions, but you have to go in a moment. So I'm going to shorten it because I actually think you've answered one of them. I was going to talk about the kind of clients that you have, but I would kind of hazard the guess that the people that you see ranges everything from parents and their children right to parents themselves, older people. I don't think, well, you tell me, is there a stereotypical patient, so to speak, customer, client, or that's not really the case? And from what we've spoken about, the fact that it's become more accessible, people need at different times or different walks of life, it's now become more of a generalist thing.
Before I answer that, let me just talk about Maslow's hierarchy.
Yes, sure.
In actual fact, this is what's fascinating, why I love psychology, continue to learn. If you go back to Maslow's original papers, it wasn't a hierarchy.
It wasn't a triangle upside down?
No, not. It's not a hierarchy. It doesn't mean that those steps don't exist,
right?
Where you move through them, but it wasn't that one needs to be met, then the other one, then the other. You can actually jump around, and his original paper talks about that, and I've got a copy if you want to look at it. It's really interesting. But moving in terms of the second part of the question, I should probably say it's probably some advertising and marketing guy that decided to draw the triangle to make it easy for everyone. It is everywhere. That's it's hard to find it not being spoken. And it's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
So
and that's how it is. But moving along, in terms of who are my clients, and also putting this in the context of within private practice,
of course,
they look like you and I.
Very good looking.
Very good looking. Charming, handsome,
yes,
all those qualities.
Well dressed.
They come from all walks of life, and you would not be able to distinguish between one versus another or have any visual understanding. There's actually even studies in psychology that have demonstrated that even if you put health professionals to view people and try and pick who's got what so-called, air quotes, disorder, they're not able to pick it. So you can go out, and there's actually a good sheet TV show, I think it was called How Mad Am I? Which effectively just puts a panel of, I think there's a psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, something like that, and they get to view people who have got, in theory, a certain condition. For example, let's say an OCD presentation, obsessive compulsive disorder, a presentation with germs, for example, or someone who might have social anxiety, and the like, and they just observe them and watch them doing certain activities. And without being able to interview them, like, what you might do in a therapy room, they're not able to actually pick who's got what. Just because you'll actually notice that when you put someone in a germ environment, most of us are squirmish to do those things. Right. And similarly, when you go out and say, we're going to ask everyone to do stand-up comedy segment, we all find it difficult to speak in public, particularly if, we're fearful of being judged. And so the person who's socially anxious actually looks like everyone else. It's just what's going on the inside that tends to change, or avoidance, for example. So the people that I see are like you and I, that from every
Yeah.
walk of life, every profession. I'd say every age group, but I don't see children myself.
Sure.
But everyone comes into our clinic.
Mm.
What is interesting, we don't have many clients that I would say are in the geriatric age,
Sure.
so to speak. And I'm not sure why, but I can only assume that maybe they've figured some things out. Maybe
Maybe
they've
they saw
got,
the light. Yeah.
maybe they've got some greater level of acceptance.
Sure.
Maybe they've been challenged so many times in life that they've had the opportunity to adopt and to learn that.
Actually, there was an article that I read about the fact that it is, of course, stereotyping broadly, but the reason that elderly people tend to be more calm around things is because they've accepted things and therefore have this patience and almost let it be attitude, which says things have happened in the past, they'll happen again. This is how we deal with it. That stress is not going to help you deal with it
It
anymore.
it sounds like a reasonable hypothesis. At the same time, it doesn't mean that, a lot of old people don't feel,
No,
all the great challenges of
of
life in
course.
terms of, we know that depression tends to kick in. There's medical problems, there's mobility problems, there's certainly loneliness that comes up. So it's not that, you age into, into, your oldest age of life
Infinite
and things
wisdom.
are rosy, but
Yeah.
not by any stretch of the imagination. But for some reason, they don't attend nearly as much, at least in our clinic. So, what does it say? I'm not quite sure, but I'd like to think that we get more opportunities as we grow to adopt new perspectives and come to terms with some things that we might not need to fight anymore.
It gives me hope. One last question, and that is for those who are bitten somewhat, a little bit, or interested in psychology. And there's a lot of, I guess, well, it's termed pop psychology, and there's a lot of stuff on social media that kind of leads into it. And people do have to be careful about what they listen to and to whom. I find that very often, especially on social media, people will take one idea, one concept, and make it this binary rule. It's this or absolute rule. While psychology, as we've just talked about, is about fluidity and application, and it really depends on people, and it's about changing perspectives and so on. So that's a simple thing. But I remember, my team really loved the presentation that I did about how to manage people and yourself at meetings. Pretty basic stuff. But what I usually what I lent into, sorry, in that presentation was actually mostly body language stuff and how to connect people and how to give them the idea that you've got attentiveness and how to deal with somebody that might be a bit hostile and how to read that room in order to give you the strength and the power to be yourself and perform well. And they really loved it, right? Again, very basic stuff. But I guess from your perspective, if somebody wanted to dip into the world of psychology to kind of start understanding different ideas, perhaps beyond basic ones like I've just mentioned around body language and so on in meetings, but perhaps something to do more with more complicated comms. How do you justify, validate people's emotions, those kind of things, which, by the way, I still struggle with. All those kind of things. Where would you think they should go? What kind of things should they lean into, read, explore that won't take them the wrong path of, again, this very pop stuff?
I have a little bit of a bias in terms of the acceptance and commitment therapy stuff that I work with, and so I'd probably point people generally probably towards themselves in the first instance. Understanding oneself is, I think, incredibly valuable, and then being able to apply that outwardly. A great book to start with might be, or is, from my perspective, Steve Hayes' book.
Okay.
Stephen C. Hayes, Stephen with a V. And his book is Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. It's an absolutely fantastic book. It is a little bit exercise hungry,
okay,
but the ideas of the exercises are really to go out and provide an exemplar of, or to demonstrate a philosophy that is being put forward for someone to potentially, explore further. He has a book as well, another book called A Liberated Mind, also quite exceptional. you can go out on YouTube, Stephen
Okay.
C. Hayes. I think he is probably a very good person to lean into, and he's
Great.
very entertaining, but it's very psychologically sound.
Yeah.
There's so many places. I certainly would say steer away from, your TikToks and the like, and your little sound bites. I think anything that allows for nuance to be discussed is the place to go. So long form podcasts. And to be fair, I think it's about how you read. There's great importance in reading, but reserving judgment, being curious, but still asking questions and being skeptical. We've got to continue to ask these questions. Where do they come from? Where's the author coming from? What biases they have? I've got every bias under the sun. How many times have I already spoke about acceptance and commitment therapy?
Sure.
It's like I'm getting kickbacks from them. But it's because I'm clearly passionate about it. That's my style. And there's some biases that are in that space. And so I think being critical is important. And long form is important, reading at depth, and it's about collecting information rather than saying this is the source of information.
Yeah, sure.
And so talking about it, discussing it, we're in a process ourselves of learning what psychology is for ourselves and how it shows up for ourselves, and what introspection I can do, how I'll apply it, how I apply it when I'm cranky, how I apply it when I'm tired, how I apply it when something's really important and meaningful, and particularly with the people we love. That's where we're the worst. But there's so many places that, if you're interested, don't necessarily try and find one place. I think a philosophical approach is great as well.
Sure.
Reading the great religions is great. I'm not religious myself, but there's such great value in trying to understand all of these texts.
Great. Thank you. I thought it'd be a nice bit of advice. Recommended reading, or whatever I should call this section at the end. Thank you very much for your time. I realize we have gone over, so there's probably somebody waiting outside. Thank you. I really appreciate this. I was really looking forward to it for many reasons. And in fact, that's why I decided to reach out to you, because I thought, that's it. Time is time. I need to speak to a real psychologist and figure some things out. It's been a real pleasure, quite opening. I'm sure it'll be, actually eye-opening, I should probably say. And also, I'm certain that I'll be thinking about a lot of this for days to come. So,
my pleasure, and thank you as well.
Pleasure.